lot of lives being lifted, and also to local football organizations. I'm a football coach. We have several football coaches and families in here, and we know there's character building that goes in those places. And so all the funds that are raised are going to go directly to those places, but there's some stories that you may not know about, what I think is amazing. Already, people have registered. There's a lady who, if she's not 100% sightless, she is very, very close. And she has been working on getting her life, trying to get life pointed. And one of the things that she's been doing is training and preparing to run in a race. The woman is blind. She'll be running in her first race on Saturday in the 5K. Hosted by Grace Fellowship Church. A lot of people, you've poured yourselves into that. And you get to see something. What extraordinary faith it would require to have no idea where you're going, but just being led by hand or by voice by somebody else, and you're running in a race. That's an amazing thing. There's well over 200 people who've already registered for this thing. All that stuff is really neat. So please, participate in this thing. Please. You can't possibly be doing anything else that would be bigger than the eternality of what's going on just this Saturday, and the chance for us to be a connection to our community, to God. Second thing, you may have seen, there's a couple other stuff going on. We have a Christmas, our youth ministry for the last couple of years has been the springboard for giving things to people in need over the course of the holiday season, specifically into Christmas. And if you go down into the youth room, which is directly below where I am standing right now, there'll be a bin there, a box there of some kind where you can drop in. It could be clothes, it could be food. I believe they'll take gift cards and cash. That stuff can be donated. Make sure you designate it when you, even if you want to give during the offering over the course of the next couple of weeks. That ends when, by the way? Do we have an end date? December the 14th. Okay, so you got a little bit of time, but don't hold your breath too long, because there's a lot of good that can happen, and the more that comes in, the more that we know we can do with it. A part of that also is that we're having a team of almost 30 people that will be going to Guatemala in February, or I'm sorry, in early March. And when you walked in the door today, you may have noticed something sitting on your left, which is it's a place where you can throw in coins. It's a well where we're going to be gathering just your extra coins thrown in there, and all that is going to be going towards some of the opportunities we have to serve in March in Guatemala. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you're walking in here today and you're like, I don't know what these people are like, it's kind of different than my experience or my expectation, know this, is that we're trying to lift. We're trying to lift, because God has changed something about us, but also to keep track of some of these things that are going on. It's not one thing, there's like a zillion things, and it's hard to keep track of. Please, you know what? If all you can do is to help in one way, do that. So there's the sermon announcement, the whole whatever that thing is together, all together once. Now, we're almost halfway through this series we've been doing in the books of Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua. Now, this series became fully formed last spring. And this particular, I love all the messages, and I love the stories that we're finding in, but this particular message I don't remember ever preaching about, and have been really excited to tell you a couple of stories since that first got formed for this particular day. And so I've been praying about that since the day it got set. There are a few women, there's a woman, I should say, few if any of us actually have known about before today. She is not famous. It's probably the reason you don't know her. If she was famous in her little town, it was because she had a strange little concoction of rotting melons. She would mix rotting melons and half-fermented sugar that she would make as a very special local drink that came only in her cafe. I don't know why that would make her famous, but her only notable quality, however, was something that she picked up growing up. Her only notable quality was that she had learned a second language. She was just a regular woman, a mother of 2 daughters. With her husband, she ran this small country cafe next to what would be, all the time before then, a very insubstantial bridge. No one would pay it any mind if you rode your bike over it, if you walked over it, if you drove over it. Before this day, you would not have even noticed it. All right? And her little cafe is sitting right next to this particular bridge in a tiny little village called Bennoville that no one would ever have heard of if D-Day had not happened. Her name is Teresa Gondry. Her village, this little town of Bennoville, France, was suffering under its 1450th night, almost 1,500 nights of occupation by the Nazi forces, occupied in this particular case, though, by 50 German soldiers. And they were guarding this particular bridge on purpose, this bridge which was directly adjacent to this cafe of the Gondrys. As historian Stephen Ambrose would point out, that this tiny, otherwise completely unknown bridge held the key to success for the entire D-Day invasion. Because we're Americans, most of us, I would assume, most of us are Americans, we have our kind of view of history, but this particular bridge held the key to the entire invasion. It was going to be handled by the British that particular day. And what would happen is that the forces would be attempting to advance inland about 3 miles from where the beach was, at Sword Beach, and it was dependent, this advancement was dependent upon this particular bridge being in Allied hands. The reason why is, without securing this bridge, the Allies would be dangerously exposed to an overwhelming amount of German response by tank and by troop. If this bridge was available to the Germans, they could cross back and reinforce, because they're just sitting back off the coast, waiting for an invasion just like this. They knew it was coming, and so they set their troops and their tanks back, ready to respond. If they had access to that bridge, they could immediately go to Sword Beach, take it out, and then leave the entire flank of the invasion completely open to tank and air. And they would have wiped it out, driven the entire force back into the sea. So we can't make enough about this. Even Stephen Ambrose himself says there's not enough to be made of this particular little bridge in this little bitty town of Benneville, France. And two interesting people, one in particular, a lady named Teresa Gondry, who has something to do with it. So this bridge is pretty critical. Again, as I said before, it's only about 3 miles away from the English Channel, from the gigantic invasion force that was coming later that day of over 160,000 soldiers were going to land on day 1 of D-Day. Can you imagine that? 160,000 moving from one place over boat onto land against enemy fire, and they were going to land here. Well, it's about 3 miles from where that particular Sword Beach was going to happen, and it was that important. Well, along with serving the village's small French population any given day of life, the Gondrys are forced to serve drinks and food to someone else, and I can expect you probably understand who that would be. It's the occupying German forces. And with that, little Madame Gondry had to tolerate the humiliations that go in those kind of situations. The comments, the grabs from behind, the ogles, the things that occupying troops do to women. 4 years of suffering at the hands of these Nazis. Now, I said that Teresa Gondry was not famous necessarily, but that's not to say that she wasn't quietly heroic. You see, that second language she had picked up as a child was the language of German. Now, the funny thing is the Germans did not know she knew German. So as she would serve them their food and their drinks, and they would do the things that they do while she was doing that, the humiliations, she would act like, and they didn't have no idea, but she would act like she didn't understand a thing they were saying, even though she did. Apparently, when soldiers drink a lot and they talk with one another while they're drinking a lot, they tell a whole lot of really important things, especially if they think there's no possibility of someone understanding what they're saying. And that's exactly what happened during that period of time, over 1,400 days of occupation. So Teresa Gondry, this little old waitress, would record and communicate each comment, each troop activity, each strategic placement, and each German tactic that she would hear from them. She would communicate it to the French resistance, who would then pass it on to the Allied forces who were already making plans 2 years before this, pass it on to them and all the Allied planners. And it turns out every bit of information she gave was point on. Now, the most strategic bridge that would lead to D-Day's long-term success or failure was in the hands of a waitress who acted like she didn't know German. 1,450, if you're a woman, if you're a husband of a woman, if you're a son of a woman, imagine how that feels. 1,450 sunups and sundowns. She, along with her family, would have to bite her lip, serve the drinks, brush off pinches and grabs from every part of her body, and bide her time. And then just simply do one thing: pray for redemption. Pray for rescue from the pigs, from the tyrants that had stolen her country, her little village, her business, and her family. A lot had been stolen, and so all she could do was just do what she could do and pray for redemption. More about Teresa Gondry a little bit later. I'd like to introduce to you another woman. So if you have a Bible, open it up to the book of Joshua. Another woman who would change the course of another historic battle. While you're turning there to the book of Joshua, again, this is the 6th book into the Old Testament, so right from the beginning, the book of Joshua is the 6th book there. For those of you who've been here at part of this series we've been doing called Breakthrough, you remember last week we found out that Israel is sitting right directly on the border of the land of promise. Geographically speaking, there was only a river between them and the land of promise. But specifically between them is a military complication which could potentially repel Israel from getting their toe in the door in the land of promise, the land that God had promised well over 500 years before to a man they knew as their patriarch, Abraham. This military complication was a city songwriters, even 3,000 years later, would write songs about. It's the town of Jericho. So just as his predecessor, Moses, had done 39 years before this, Joshua sends in a couple of spies to just get a read on the land, but specifically tell the story of a city that we've been hearing about for quite a while. Tell us about Jericho. Chapter 2 in Joshua, verse 1. The scriptures read that Joshua secretly sent out 2 spies from the Israelite camp at Acacia Grove. He instructed them scout out the land on the other side of the Jordan River, especially around Jericho. So the 2 men set out and came to the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there that night. Just so you know, Jericho proper was not a massive metropolis. If you grew up in Sunday school and you were given the impression of what Jericho was or wasn't, it usually was that it's a massive city with gigantic what? Walls, right? That's what it's famous for its walls. Actually, the walls that would come a-tumbling down, right? Well, it was not a massive metropolis as far as, especially inside the walls. Archaeologist studies have revealed that the city, the walled part of the city, was about 12 acres total. About 12 acres, with a small spring that rolled along its eastern wall. That may not seem all that large, but keep in mind the entire World Trade Center area sits atop only 16 acres. To kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about. You can do a lot on a little bit of space. But that said, by ancient standards, Jericho was a medium-sized city, but it was tough. And it was right in the way of the land of promise. This was the way to enter, and you'd have to go past them. You got to take that town, and you got to go from there. Its surrounding communities and support system and population would have made this a very formidable enemy for anybody who would want to be bold enough to come up and fight it or lay siege against it. But I won't say much more about it than today, because we're actually going to talk in a couple of weeks about the wall of Jericho and about the battle of Jericho. But I wanted to give you a little bit of context of a person who lived in this city, the woman around whose life and story today is about. Well, when the leaders of Jericho hear that these spies have slipped in, they confront Rahab. They assume, because they have a little bit of sense of her livelihood, she is probably an innkeeper. They also have a sense of her larger livelihood, which she is a prostitute. Rahab is one of the first people they're going to go knocking on the door to. A prostitute. This is an important piece of information. In the sequence of the Bible, it is extremely important, or at least interesting, where it's placed. I told you a moment ago, for those of you who are just becoming familiarized with the Bible, the book of Joshua is the 6th. It's the first book that follows the Torah, or some people refer to it as the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, written primarily by Moses. The Torah spends a whole lot of time in story and in commandment talking about sinful living, about the sinfulness, the fallenness, the brokenness, and even a lot of time talking about having sexual life outside of marriage. There are commandments and a lot of stories in those first 5 books talking about the dangers of that kind of lifestyle. So it's interesting that the very first few words of that next book, the book of Joshua, highlight that Israel was helped by a known prostitute. Of course, understand what this is not. It is not a repudiation of anything that happened in the Torah, nor is it a pass on sexual sin. Sexual sin is what it is. It's pretty clearly cut throughout the Bible. We won't spend any time talking about it, but it's not a pass on those things. But it's one story, we'll find, in a long line of stories in the Bible about how God uses unlikely people. Really unlikely people, but willing people. Really unlikely, but really willing sinners to bring about the good of his kingdom. So, Rahab, we know they're in there. There's only 2 of these places in town. You're one of them. They're not there. They must be here. So Rahab answers the door and tells the king and his soldiers that the Hebrew spies had in fact come to her inn, but that they had slipped out earlier, slipped out of the city, and were on the road back. They were trying to make their path back to their camp. This is a lie, of course, because we find in the story they're actually up on top of the roof of her home, hiding there, but but it gets the cops out of the neighborhood long enough for her to do something, to talk to the two spies, to verify something that she had heard and had questions about in regards to their God. We've heard that Yahweh, your God, parted the Red Sea. Is that true? Yes. We heard that he gave you food by miracle. Is that true? Yes. We heard that he brought water out of a rock. Is that true? Yes. We heard he brought quails out of nowhere to give you food. Is that true? Yes. And she probably goes through a laundry list of what she had heard as rumor. Tell me the truth about your God. And she ascertains from this kind of conversation, the gods of Jericho are nothing like that. I want to find out more about your God, because if nothing else, I am fearful of him. But that fear begins to turn into an awe. And what she finds out after this conversation, she wants to broker a deal. She wants to get out of Jericho. This is a sinking ship, and she realizes that the people of Israel and their God, there's something unique about it. So she spends the time that she has to broker a deal, because she's going to be offering confidences as well as courage in protecting these two guys. Chapter 2, verse 8. The story keeps going. Before the spies went to sleep that night, Rahab went up on the roof to talk with them. I know the Lord has given you this land, she told them. We're all afraid of you. Everyone in the land is living in terror, for we've heard how the Lord made a dry path for you through the Red Sea when you left Egypt. We know what you did to Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings east of the Jordan River, whose people you completely destroyed. No wonder our hearts have melted in fear. No one has the courage to fight after hearing such things. Here it is. For the Lord your God is the supreme God of the heavens above and the earth below. Now swear to me by that Lord, the Lord, that you will be kind to me and my family since I've helped you. Give me some guarantee that when Jericho is conquered, you will let me live along with my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all of their families. A little note that follows a verse or two later that says this. Simply, Rahab's house was built into the town wall. This is where her home, her inn, and her ring of prostitution operated out of up to this point. That last fact helps us understand a little bit about the big deal about Rahab's salvation. And it also helps us understand the passage itself about how big of a deal Rahab's protection of these two would be. Her house is literally built into the walls that are soon to come tumbling down. If the walls come down, her house is demolished. It's built into it. So instead of perishing in calamity, she, her family, and those around her will be saved alive. Preserved alive because she had believed in, even if it's only this much, even if it's only built on this much of an idea, it teaches us something, people, about how forgiving God is, how gracious he is, even with the smallest kernel of understanding and faith. She believes a little and she responds in faith to saying, I will protect you. Please save us. Chapter 1, verse 17. Before these two spies left, the men told her, we will be bound by the oath that we've taken only if you follow these instructions. When we come into the land, you must leave this scarlet rope they give to her, hanging from the window through which you let us down. So apparently in the wall, there's a window connected to her home. And all your family members, your father, mother, brothers, and all your relatives must be here inside this house. If they go out into the street and are killed, it will not be our fault. But if anyone lays a hand on people inside this house, we will accept the responsibility for their death. If you betray us, however, we're not bound by this oath in any way. And she replies simply, I accept your terms. And she sent them on their way, leaving the scarlet rope hanging from the window. It's like a real story. So she keeps her word and she protects the spies. The spies keep their word, and on their return to Jericho, they're going to do something about it. So Joshua, later on, as the story develops in the book of Joshua, Joshua hears the report, but he also hears about this particular woman. And so he says something in chapter 6. So again, if you have a Bible on your lap, you can turn there. Otherwise, you can see it on the screen. After hearing the report of the two spies, here's what he said to them. Keep your promise. Go to the prostitute's house and bring her out, along with all of her family. The men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, mother, brothers, and all the other relatives who were with her. All the promises kept. And they move her whole family to a safe place near the camp of Israel. They bring a Canaanite enemy prostitute into the fold. They bring a Canaanite enemy prostitute into the fold because God had done that. Now, something really simple before we finish today. Why does the Bible tell us this story? Sometimes we're so familiar with the basic Sunday school version of the story that we almost lose track of the simple question, which is, why is it there? What's the point? What's the big story? How does this story really advance the larger story? Rahab does not actually help the cause other than just not talking. She keeps them hidden overnight. This would probably happen in almost every single battle for every single army and every single civilization down throughout history. This is not a mind-blowing or unique story. Even getting hidden by a prostitute isn't unique alone in history either. In the annals of war, this is not the biggest story. This happens a lot. She offers no tactical or strategic advantage. She doesn't even give them information beyond what they had probably already ascertained themselves. She only offers a night of hiding. So why did... I know, son, but I've not gotten to the story yet. All right. Or are you wanting me to hurry up to get to the point? Okay, good. I will. So why does the Bible tell her story? Well, apparently, even the smallest of actions move the needle just enough in faith and in the kingdom of God. Even the smallest of actions by the smallest of people move the needle just enough so God can be seen, so God can be freed up to bless the world, which is what we're doing here, remember. That's why we're here. God wants his people to have a platform for the promise. He wants to be a blessing to the world, so all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's the promise that he gave to Abraham 500 plus years before. They're getting into this land of promise so they can have the platform, and even the smallest of actions moves the needle just a little bit. You don't have to turn there, but I want to share with you something that comes from the New Testament about a woman who was a Canaanite, former enemy, prostitute. He says this in the book of James. As the scriptures say, Abraham believed God and counted him as righteous because of his faith. He's talking about Abraham, the patriarch, right? He was even called the friend of God. So you see, we're shown to be right with God by what we do, not by faith alone. This is an important dynamic. Belief automatically springs this action. The very next verse says this. Rahab, the prostitute, is another example. She was shown to be right with God by her actions when she hid those messengers and sent them safely away by a different road. Rahab mattered, friends, because small acts of faith and action matter to God and to the kingdom being brought into the world. Small actions, even the smallest acts of faith. This is an astounding statement in the book of James. It's astounding. Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute, who Moses and the Word of God had spent so much time talking about right kind of living, not that it's negated, but that it means in light of this still, God is a God of grace. Because the very next person we hear about is this woman who's a Canaanite, an enemy. Somebody who has worshipped other gods and who is also a prostitute. She is held in equivalent regard directly next to the patriarch of Israel, Abraham. How can an Abraham and a prostitute be mentioned in the same sentence as a people of faith? Welcome to the kingdom of God. Add to this, the Bible also tells us this story about Rahab because there is a bigger story going on about her and her role in history. In many ways, this may be a setup for us to understand a larger story. A Canaanite, an enemy, and a prostitute. None of these things keep God from using her in that moment, nor what he will use her for later. Ultimately honoring her because of her simple act of faith. She's actually famous most for being used in a really amazing way. She ends up changing the direction of her life, clearly. This moment with the spies on the wall changes something in her. She hears something of Yahweh, and she says, I don't understand it all, but I understand enough. I'm going to change something right now.